to impacts the foreign military bases necessary on the African continent, especially in the handing over of the last military bases over to the Chadian National Army recently, or like we have seen in recent African countries, from Djibouti to Ghana, from Sahel to the Horn of Africa. Nations face complex security threats, citing the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we saw the presence of MONUSCO, the UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC. And do foreign troops offer real solutions to the problems facing these African countries, or do they serve interests beyond African borders? That is a question for today. On this edition of Talking Points, we bring together experts to dissect the military, economic and political implications of foreign bases on the African continent. Is this a partnership for progress or a lingering shadow of external control? Stay with us as we uncover these facts, challenge perspectives, and get to the truth behind the African military landscape. Welcome to Talking Points, and the conversation starts now. It's a new day to talk matters affecting the African continent and beyond on 4U Media Africa. And of course, this is a talking point where we decrypt what's happening on the African continent and beyond. And today we focus on the presence of foreign military bases on the African continent. A few days ago, we saw the handing over in a chart of, the bases, military bases in the country to the National Army. And we've seen this trend in recent years across various African countries, notably in West Africa. And we saw the announcements of the Ivorian president at the start of this year, 2025, that the country was going, the troops present, foreign troops present in the country were going to get back to their nations of origin. Today, we're asking the question, are foreign military bases necessary on the African continent? Are they worsening the issues which they are called to address, or are they fixing them? We shall be unpacking that with our guests. And first of all, to kickstart and introduce you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, you're joining us in your capacity as a Pan-African, an economist, and a fintech expert. You're welcome on board.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and thank our viewers for tuning in as well. And obviously, I hope we'll have a fruitful conversation today.
Indeed, we look forward to fruitful conversations. Just to reiterate that a few minutes from now, we shall be joined by Modeste NKURIKIYIMANA in his capacity as a Pan-African as well, a Great Lakes, a political analyst, and a senior journalist. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, we shall dive deep into today's conversation. And of course, we kickstart the conversation, and I'll be debating with you, Dr. FONGOD. Like I mentioned in our preamble today, we're discussing the presence of foreign military bases on the African continent. Now, in a bit to comprehend the presence, of these foreign troops on the African soil, what is your appraisal of the recent withdrawal of, foreign troops from Chad, getting back to France? And this comes amidst this call and the recent reckoning of if foreign military troops in the African continent are actually necessary.
Well, you see, it depends on who you're asking that question to, especially if you live in the West and you're part of the Western cabal that has literally looked at the continent of Africa to become their camping ground, and also a place where they can stage, their foreign diplomacy with the barrel of a gun, and which is what these military bases are actually meant for. Then obviously you start thinking that those military bases actually do cater for some of the issues that is happening on the continent of Africa. We have come of age, absolutely, to be able to take care of ourselves. But the reality is that there have always been reasons why we have this military bases. So the issues of security and counterterrorism has been used, especially by the United States, has been used by France, has been used by China to be able to solve the issues that the continent is grappling with. But what we have seen over the years has been the fact that even though we have these military bases, Al-Shabaab has basically increased the military base, terrorist organizations like Boko Haram has also increased. And then we have ISIS now operating in northern Nigeria, ISIS operating in the Sahel. We have Al-Qaeda basically roaming free in the Sahara. This in itself has not helped. So the military bases in itself has really not solved the issues of insurgency, has not solved the issues of terrorism, and we have absolutely not seen anything tangible that has been done as a result of the military bases we have across the continent of Africa. So I think that we have to relook that, and from an Afrocentric perspective, there is no reason why we should be talking about having any military bases on the continent of Africa at all. Frankly speaking, it has not helped. In other words, it has actually attracted a lot of issues that we do not need on the continent of Africa. We have become a staging ground for proxy wars. We have become a staging ground, for insurgency and counterattacks from terrorist organizations like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, that comes to fight foreign entities on African soil, and the African is just collateral damage. We have to be able to find ways in which we do not bring ourselves, to become grounds for proxy wars.
Now, thank you so much. Like I mentioned earlier on, I cited that the presence of these military bases could be, linked sometimes to neo-colonial presence of the former colonial masters in the countries. And at this particular point, we've seen the evolution of, the presence of foreign military bases. Initially, they were required to fight insecurity in countries like you cited in the Sahel, in the Lake Chad regions, and amidst others. But at this particular point, these foreign military troops are being ousted from the countries in which they once regarded as home. But that is not the point here. How has this, this foreign military presence on the African soil evolved over the past years? And at this point, you mentioned in your previous response that there is no reason why we should have foreign military bases on the African soil. So what could we say? Which African countries at this point are hosting these foreign military bases, and what might be the agenda behind this presence on the African continent?
As a Pan-Africanist, the presence of foreign military bases on the African continent is quite toxic, and it undermines African sovereignty. It foils a lot of issues on the continent, which most people are kind of scared to talk about it. I think that the exploitation on the economic front, it's primarily the reason why we basically have most of these military bases, to say the least. It is the competition that most foreign powers have so far as African natural resources are concerned, and that is primarily the reason why we have these military bases in the first place. There's the violation of our sovereignty, and this is nothing else but a new colonial control. So if we are going to start talking about how we can be able to, get Africa to a place of great independence where we start having, to forge our own future and create a path for us and our children, we have to start thinking effectively on how we can be able to handle the issues of security. If anybody is talking about anything that has to do with security, you need to look at the DRC. In the DRC, we have UN workers who are in uniform, holding a gun, but also holding a shovel. All right, a U.S. military worker holds a gun and he holds a shovel because while he is there in the name of peacekeeping, he is also a miner. So everybody is mining, and that basically tells you the reason why these military bases are actually there in the first place. It's a rush for the cursed commodity that lies on the African continent, and so far as the Western world is concerned, the African does not know what to do with it, and they are there to collect it as if to say some kind of a God-given right. Look at a nation like Djibouti. All right, it is nothing else but a neo-colonial military hub. Djibouti is literally home to U.S. military bases, is home to French military bases, is home to Italian military bases, and Japanese military bases. So you have to ask yourself, what is China? Why is America? Why is Italy? why is Japan doing in Djibouti? What is it that they are absolutely looking at that little island nation, tiny nation rather, east of Africa? And so the reality is that, and if you look at what is happening in Djibouti right now, they have no right to self-determination. And the reason for that is because you really can't say anything. The U.S. military is spending close to about $63 million in that particular part of the world and in that country, and the people are absolutely benefiting nothing from it. So we have to come to a place where we start asking ourselves, why should we allow our countries to be militarized at the expense of our own national sovereignty, at the expense of our own security, at the expense of our own self-determination? Why should we allow other people to tell us exactly how to live, why we should live, and why don't the U.S. allow us to also have our own military bases in the United States of America? When was the last time a country like Djibouti had a military base in France? All right, that in itself will never happen. All right, that would be an act of war. But so far as it comes to the African, we're kind of demented. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to do it. So obviously anybody can say anything to us. And I think that you only need to blame the people who are at the helm of our leadership. Because frankly speaking, it takes a certain level of madness and stupidity to be able to allow this thing to persist and to continue, despite all the evidence that we've seen that is in antithesis to what is it that we want to espouse as Africans.
It's true, you stated actually in your response that you rarely see the presence of, African military bases in foreign countries, but it is the case on the African soil. Now, taking the case of the DRC, which you brilliantly stated as an example in your response, when you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially at this point where we have the escalation of the crisis in that part of the African continent, just yesterday we saw, foreign fighters that were being sent out of the Democratic Republic of Congo to get back to their homeland and had been present on the country, but yet we still saw the escalation of these tensions. So at this point, do these foreign military bases genuinely enhance security on the African continent? Or do they contribute more to instability?
They contribute more to instability, and the reason is because if you think about what is going on, they use Africa as a battleground for global struggle. And that is absolutely what has been happening. And then the rise of insurgency, basically reacting to foreign interventions on the continent of Africa is something that is well documented. And the idea is that we basically have military bases on the continent of Africa that is, that is there to do nothing else but rival factions is not helping us and does not help the interest of the African. The reality is that if you look at the United States, you look at the French presence in the Sahel, places like Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, you will realize that we've had increase in the presence of terrorist activities in those areas because ISIS is out there. They're not primarily fighting those for the Burkinabes. They are not primarily fighting the Senegalese. They are out there fighting the U.S. presence in those areas. And so we attract wars and issues we have no reason, attracting. We've been talking about how long have we had the existence of Boko Haram, and that in itself has not done anything. Niger was not able to do anything so far as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, in the Maghreb is concerned. None of these things has been able to work. So the reality is this: if you take out the one element that has been present and that has not done anything to be able to shape the future of the region, which are these military bases, if you take them out, then we know precisely what we're dealing with, we know who we're dealing with, and we know why we're dealing with them. We can be able to address that issue and we can solve that particular problem. To have somebody who stands as a referee, but whose interest is actually with the cash commodity that is present on the African continent, that in itself will never bring us to a place of peace. We have to start thinking for ourselves.
It's on that note that I'll just usher in Modeste NKURIKIYIMANA, who's joining us all the way from Kigali. Thank you immensely for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me too, and my apologies to have struggled about this kind of network and everything.
Yeah, but thank you immensely. So I was discussing with your co-panelists about the presence of foreign military bases in Africa and a bit to understand the concept around this topic of discussion. And like the conversation proceeds, he was mentioning that he's of the view actually that foreign military bases are not really in the interest of the African continent. They are not there to genuinely enhance security across Africa. He cited, he cited Djibouti, he cited the Democratic Republic of Congo and other countries, especially those countries in the Sahel region, where we saw the member states of the IES, that is the Alliance of Sahel States, where we saw them leave the regional bloc and of course they chased out the French troops in their country. Away from that, do you equally agree that French troops are not out to enhance security in Africa, but there to create instability?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the co-panelist. Actually, what he has been stipulating is very true, and unfortunately, we African people, I don't know why we ignore this. No country actually is there for you. All the country is just there for its own interest. I don't think for us to be stable and stabilize our countries, we need to import or to bring peacekeepers from very far. If Africans actually should connect themselves, I think maybe within themselves it could have brought sustainable and lasting peace in our continent, because wherever they have been, like for example, when we talk about the DRC, where they have been since 1999, they have done nothing. Like in the Sahel, as he has been talking about, they have done nothing, and not because they have failed militarily, that they don't have the power to make it, but simply because they don't want to make it. Because once they make it, their country will be impoverished. They just get and gain much from the wars that we African creates under their cause. When they want things to be worse, they worsen them. And unfortunately, we keep saying and crying that they are the only ones to save us from the issues they have created against us because of course, their plans. So as my colleague have been stupidly saying it, we don't need to sit down and think that we will rely on the Western world or even the so-called UN mission keepers. Never, it won't happen. It will never happen because, like for example, those who were in Rwanda in 1994, the genocide that were perpetrated against the Tutsis happened when they were there. They did nothing. Simply, the only Rwandans who were just committed to liberate their fellow Rwandans did it. And this doesn't mean that the France mission, which was here, the UN mission keepers who were in Rwanda, it doesn't mean that they were not having the abilities. They were having all the necessary materials to really make it. But they didn't because maybe if they make it, they will be destroying the interest of their countries. You can't tell me that, like for example, those who were in Burkina Faso currently, they have never failed to do it, but they didn't come for that. The same for DRC. DRC in Africa, it is the only country or the first country having a very large mission, but they do what? Nothing. Simply, they create militia who can actually be helping them get minerals from every corner of the country. So generally and briefly, what we Africans need to do is just know what we want and work for it or strive for it. Otherwise, sitting down and be just crying and say that things will happen from the Western world, it's just thinking not big. If you want for our Africa to prosper, and if we want the future generation to actually to at least survive, that is something we need to do today, and it's a kind of a revolution, an intellectual revolution that needed to start from our intellectuals. Unfortunately, they started just using the banking education that actually put them in that format of simply believing and bestowing the whole trust in the rest of the Western world. Otherwise, we all die or keep crying as if we don't have the brain. Thank you.
Thank you too. I'll be staying with you, Modest. Many a time we feel like, this basis on the African continent, some tie back to the former colonial master. Like we mentioned, we're in the neo-colonial era for this, these countries in one way or the other, getting connected to the nations, the African countries, and maybe influencing in one way or the other the decisions. And I might not go into details citing examples, but in your capacity as an expert, how do these bases impact African nations' sovereignty as well as their decision making?
Otieno Lumumba is the one who have been saying a quote that we African people, most of the time, it's us who contribute in creating our problems.
Sure.
Again, we don't need to be blaming simply and only the Western people, because we also were born after 9 months, and we have academic papers which are somehow or sometimes even equal or even further than theirs. So the issue is that Otieno Lumumba was saying that most of the time it's us voting the hyena, and by the time they will start eating, then the sheep will start crying. We need to really take our responsibilities and maybe know what we want. So as long as we don't know what we want, we will really still striving and crying, but finally we will get nothing from our cries. So the changes need to start from ourselves, from within. You will see, like for example, there have been creations of blocks, continental blocks, like the East African region, the Central Africa, whatever. But due to having some hyenas within our leaders, they sell themselves to the Western world and at a very cheaper price of destroying their own countries for the benefit of the colonial masters, and they do it willingly. Let me take an example. Like today, when Donald Trump is trying to talk about chasing out Africans for they can go in their motherlands and then start building it, they are all now striving and try to strike as if he was there to, or he's talking on things that doesn't really actually, people, why we Africans every time, and generally starting from our leaders, we always cry and do nothing? How come, like in Africa, you will see all the children of big elders or big people, big leaders, they are starting in the Western world. When someone is suffering from a very small illness, he or she would just, take a plane and then go maybe in France or somewhere else. But coming back, he or she will never plan to build even a hospital that will be helping the citizens.
The population.
We have African countries where leaders can go for the European countries for a very long period, and they never plan for their countries. But with those experiences, we even never learn something. We have experienced the death of Gaddafi. But finally, today, we can even do the worstest things against our somehow good leaders, ignoring that maybe the colonial masters are trying to use us in destroying ourselves. This kind of mindsets, we need to also work on them. Otherwise, we will all perish in this continent, which is rich actually. There's another example, like for example, we hear the DRC has almost everything that the world needs. But when you check about what they do about their everything, it's almost nothing. There is no road, there is no school, there's no hospital. And I'm saying this based on facts. So, and imagine on televisions, people will go there and then talk, no, we have all the minerals. There are countries, taking out our minerals. I saw some even debaters or panelists talking about that without even fear. People don't care and somebody can stand there and then start talking about things that I judge of being nonsense. How come we do nothing but later simply talk? Yesterday and even today morning saw the defense minister of DRC copying a speech from very, very ancient comedians and reading them as his speeches. Can you imagine? How come somebody can read a speech or can make a speech from a very historical something, you know, a film? Is that a minister, please? A minister. Can you expect that one to build something? Or somebody is just there for a photo opportunity, that, as Kagame has been saying that? We need African ambitious people who can strive and fight, maybe who can go just in Europe, in America, to study or to get intelligence, knowledge that will be brought in Africa to build our Africa. But first and foremost, before even going at school, we need to say to the Africa we want philosophy. Do we want which kind of Africa? Our mindset actually is that we always think somebody, actually in the competition of leading African countries, what I have discovered or understood is that when somebody is, we compete to lead countries like simply targeting money. And that shouldn't be our ambitions. There are leaders who have led across African countries that we really need to imitate. Like, for example, the late Julius Nyerere. The history shows us that he even died not rich. Not that the country was poor, no, but because he applied the servant leadership. That leadership that is there to serve the people. That leadership that is there to see my people will not die by by poverty while the country is rich. But those people who are visionary oriented, who can simply sit down and then debate and then make researches to see from academic things, from the theories that we have studied from schools, how we can apply them for the betterment of our continent. Otherwise, we will all die and will be contributing simply in distracting our countries. While we have universities, the researches are made, but the documents are simply in the cupboards of the universities, never exploited. Go and check. In almost all African countries, it's the same thing. Happily, I'm with a doctor, and he's really inspiring me very well. But generally, and most of the time, they are oriented in publishing. But how do we exploit the publications we have published? Are our knowledge ordinary, or how do we really exploit the academic skills or knowledges that you have had? We have a big bag of really knowledges, but how do we exploit them? That is the issue. That's where things need to be assessed. Otherwise, there's nothing. It's simply talking. Go there just in Google or use ChatGPT and then find something you can present to the people in the speeches. But waiting for something feasible, nothing. Simply, how come only the Rwandan mission in some African countries have done something? I'm not saying this just because I'm a Rwandan, no. I'm just saying this just based on the facts. Rwandan military in a mission have been in Central Africa and they have done what white people have never done. They have been in Mozambique and in a very small or short time they have done at least something. And even in Sudan, you know. But what they are doing is not that it's extraordinary. They actually do their best, which I think if those UN missions were there to do something, they have already done the outstanding. Today, the Burkina Faso is doing outstanding. They have chased out the people who came just to exploit the country. And now, when you evaluate actually what they have done and see something positive, you will see something extraordinary.
Okay.
And that is feasible everywhere in every country in Africa. The challenge is just the mindset and the willingness of the leaders that we used to have generally.
Thank you so much, Modeste, for your response. I'll be coming back to you because we equally have to, create space for Dr. FONGOD to be able to express himself, given it's a conversation. Now, Dr. FONGOD, you listened to, the numerous points brought forward by Modeste as far as, how Africa can be able to defend its own interests. But from your own point of view, how can African nations, amidst the presence of those foreign military bases that are still existing in some countries across Africa, how can Africa rely on itself? He cited a lot of, the presence of African military troops in other countries. We are seeing the deployments in Africa, across Africa, of even SADC. We've seen them in different countries across Africa in a bid to bring about peace, quell tensions in different countries. So at this point, how would you, in your perspective, how can Africa rely on itself in a bid to tame down the presence of these foreign military bases on its soil?
You can never be able to understand the exploitation of Africa if not looked at it from an economic standpoint. If you look at everywhere we have these foreign military bases, they are always strategically placed where we have rich resources in terms of our natural resources. Areas that are rich in uranium, areas that are rich in gold, diamond, lithium. Those are the areas that you always have these foreign military bases present. When you have rare minerals, you will always have them. If you looked for a country like France, for example, 20% of all of our uranium comes from Niger. So Niger is responsible for 20% of all of France's uranium. And this was the mode of operations until 2023, when Niger failed and Bazoum got kicked out, that the juntas decided to have a whole different outlook so far as France was concerned, and, good for them. Things basically change out for them on the economic front. The reality is this: we are suffering on the African continent primarily because of what we have. And unfortunately, to the African, we do not understand how to be able to manage what we have. What we have is what the world is looking for. Unfortunately, we have leaders on the continent of Africa who are neither educated on the issue, absolutely have no skill sets in leadership to be able to steer this gigantic ship, which is the continent, to the future that the continent needs to have. And so countries in the West, countries in the East are all grappling on the African continent because the continent itself is a scarce commodity. On the agricultural front alone, while the rest of the world is basically creating a very unsafe environment for their lands, especially when it comes to agriculture, there are places in the United States of America that you will, if you buy fruit from that particular area, you have labels saying that you understand that there are carcinogens in this particular thing that you're buying to eat, and yet it's a fruit. And the reason is because those areas has been laced with all kinds of toxic waste for military testing and every single thing is in between, over the years. And so the only place you have in the world that is quite virgin, that is quite good for agriculture, for example, is on the continent of Africa, where it's quite natural and very organic. And so the rest of the world understands this, and there is a rush for the continent of Africa. The only person who is not rushing to save Africa is the African. The rest of the world is absolutely racing to Africa to hold a piece of Africa for themselves. Almost everything you can think about in the northeastern portion of the continent of Africa has been bought by China. We are selling the continent wholesale at the expense of our children, at the expense of the future generation, and it's as if they say nobody can do anything about it. I think that time has come for us to even stop talking about what the West is doing on the continent of Africa, what the East is doing on the continent of Africa. We need to start asking ourselves, what the hell is going on with our leadership? What is so sad? Why is it that on the continent of Africa, the only people who care less about the continent is the leadership, is the people we have in power? And the reason is because these men are nothing else but radios all right, radios that are preset to a particular dial would not dial in up, which means that they listen to one particular channel. And I want to propose that that channel actually is either transmitting information from the West, or maybe in some rare cases, they might be transmitting information from the East. The reason is because most of the leaders we have on the continent of Africa are satellites for Western diplomacy, satellites for Western ideas, satellites for Western influence on the continent of Africa. These men look African, but they don't talk African. They look African, they don't act African. They look African, but in reality, they are not African. We need to have Pan-Africans, men with the capacity to look at Africa's future and dream and desire that something beautiful can happen to a continent as rich as Africa, without which we'll be dancing to the tune of the West, not knowing that the person we have in leadership is nothing else but a pawn in the hands of Western supremacy, Eastern supremacy, whichever ones you want to call it. We have to do something different so far as the African is concerned.
Indeed, that's why we have programs and channels like this in a bid to channel forward the Pan-African philosophy, in a bid to bring Africa to consciousness, to be able to defend the African population. I had this question for you, Dr. FONGOD, but I think I'll channel it to your co-panelists. Now, Modeste, you listen to Dr. FONGOD and his point of view. Now, picking up from where he stopped, every country that has a foreign military base on the African continent has its own interest. Your co-panelist stated that these countries will come with their various interests, which is to defend, first of all, their homeland, like you mentioned in your previous response. Now, looking at the case of the African continent, how do these military bases, which we have started, they range from the United States to France, China, and so on and so forth, and they are present in just rich regions across the African continent, how do they go a long way in influencing diplomatic relations, between African nations? This question is for you, Modeste. Modeste, are you with us? Well, we're hoping on Modeste to get to us. I'll just get the question. And God, please, could you proceed? Okay, so in the course of this edition of the program, we're discussing, foreign military presence on the African continent. And of course, in the course of this edition, we're focusing on asking the question if these military bases in Africa is indeed necessary in a time when we've seen Africa, come into consciousness and striving for its own development. In recent days, we saw French military troops that were present in the Central African nation of Chad's soil, handing over military bases, the final in the country, over to the national army. And this has been the trend. We saw the trend in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and Niger, and other countries in recent times, especially at the start of 2025, announced recently equally that they were able to going to get rid of foreign military troops in the country. But these, as reiterated by the president of Chad, it does not go a long way in cutting off the relations they have with the former colonial masters, but just that they don't want the foreign military troops on their soil. So with our guests this day, we're trying to decrypt this topic of discussion while reiterating some of the points made by our panel of experts this day. Dr. FONGOD, on his part, stated that every country that comes on the African soil do have a role to play. They come in, to defend the countries for which they are originating from. And on the other hand, Modeste, who joined us all the way from Kigali, equally has the point of view that Africa needs to stand up for itself, a point that has been shared by both guests. He has to stand up for his point to be able to defend the Pan-Africanism philosophy across Africa, defending the Ubuntu spirit spirit, Ubuntu philosophy that I am because you are an Africans need to be able to stand up for themselves. So if we have Modeste with us, Modeste, please, could you proceed with the question I asked earlier on how Africans, or the interest of different military bases in Africa, positioned by different countries, that is from China to France to the United States and so on and so forth, how do they go a long way in affecting diplomatic relations among African countries? Okay, Dr. FONGOD, since you're with us, could you proceed with the response?
Look, I think that one of the greatest pain that we have so far as the continent is concerned is that the continent has not come to a place where she realized that she has to be able to preserve her unity by building self-reliance. And I think that the self-reliance aspect of the continent is basically was the aspirations of men like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Mohammed Gaddafi. I think that these are the three men that basically push for this whole entire idea that you can have military presence on the continent of Africa. And I think that the only way for us to strengthen African Union and also have blocks like ECOWAS basically do have the capacity to be able to defend themselves is that we have to find ways in which we create local, regional, military support comprising of countries within this particular region. For example, ECOWAS should have a defense force that should be present in any country if something is happening, and also should defend countries if they are having an onslaught of insurgency like what is happening in the Sahel. Apart from that, to be able to bring in groups from outside of the continent to meddle with whatever is happening within this region is nothing else but setting the stage for proxy war. If you saw what happened in Senegal, I think it was Senegal recently, in Mali, recently, northern part of Mali, where you have an attack that took place on the Wagner group, which was a Russian group, and from every single indication and from all the reporting, that attack was coordinated by Ukraine. And so what is happening between Ukraine and Russia basically found itself on the African continent right in the middle of the Sahel. I think that there has to be ways in which we fully understand that we cannot be able to allow ourselves, no matter what it is, to have foreign military presence on the continent of Africa. And I do not think that it actually serves to keep the continent safe. We should not have NATO. Most of the assassinations that has taken place on the continent of Africa has taken place because of these foreign entities. Mohammed Gaddafi died as a result of NATO. Barack Hussein Obama, the wannabe whatever, was very instrumental in taking out Libya's leader, and this was done underneath the backing of NATO. So there is no reason why we should absolutely allow any of these countries, knowing the history of these nations, in assassinating our Pan-African heroes. And I think that it will be a slap to the face of our ancestors to allow these men to roam freely on the continent of Africa. At best, they should be locked up in jail for the crimes they have committed. If the international courts were never looked at it, because the international court seems to be judging only Africans, if they were never looked at it, but for some reason, for the love of God, this men should not be allowed to roam the streets of Africa for absolutely no reason. What they have done to the continent is absolutely shameful, and I think that the Africans should have enough pride to stand for themselves.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we got indications that Modeste is back with us. Now, Modeste, picking up from where your co-panelists stopped, we've seen the across Africa significant protests. We saw that in Mali, in Burkina Faso and Niger, for the withdrawal of the foreign military bases in that part of the African continent. Now, how do Africans, let's cite, for instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo, let's cite other countries across Africa. How do you, as an African, as a Pan-African as well, how do you perceive the presence of foreign military bases? Do you believe that maybe they're seen as protection, or on the other hand, they're regarded as some sort of occupation on the African soil?
You've said it all. You've said it all. They never come for protecting anything. They don't come for our benefits or interests. It's just for theirs. Actually, and what actually hurts me the most is that our leader knows it. Actually, our leader knows that the Western military forces in Africa have not come to protect or to help us prosper. They just came for their own interest. And actually, in politics, demagoguery, nobody cares about you. Simply, we can share, cooperate, you know, but none actually is caring about Africa. We are in a neo-colonialism period. Imperialism have never left us. The problem needed to be simply and only sorted out from the roots of Africans. As a Pan-Africanist, I really call upon social or civism education of our young generations for them to understand how they needed to survive, how they need to fight for the survival, and know what they need to do for the betterment of their future, and never rely on whoever else. And this needs to start from our root families. Our root families, how? Whoever is going to get married, let's make him or her responsible to the level that she or he will educate his or her child properly, understanding the whole environment, not leaving the banking education where we have been taught of just learning types of trees that we have in our area or zones, but never what or how we can exploit them in actual sense, what we can make from the woods we have.
No,
you know,
yeah.
if somebody is considered to be a scholar, how practically his knowledge or her knowledge can be exploited for the betterment, for the benefit, for the development of his or her country. That's where we will get independence. Otherwise, simply talking about, oh, they are not helping us, oh, please, let's call upon UN Security Council, oh, it ain't really help us. Why do we, the challenge is that I was actually talking about the blocks that were built in Africa, like this East African region block, the Central, the Southern, and whatever. The problem and the challenge which is there, when we have elected over those blocks, people who are not fit, I'm sorry, people maybe can say that I'm sounding not diplomatic, but I don't want to sound diplomatic to ease the mindset of somebody. I simply wish people can change. Now, sometimes instead of the blocks contributing for the development and the strengthening of the region, but also to expand from the block to another, to finally develop the whole Africa, we develop conflicts between blocks, you see? And the development of the conflicts from the block to each other are actually caused by the egocentric understanding of some leaders. Like, for example, if Modeste is now elected to be or to rule around the southern or the eastern bloc, he will simply be dealing, using the position he has or she has, targeting his own interest in this or that country, and the period will finish while he has or she has done nothing. And somebody who will be his successor will also come through those feats and stepping in the steps of his predecessor. And finally, that's how Africa simply will live in a circle that ends up having nothing. And sorry, there are our fellow Africans who will maybe stone me saying that I'm really not maybe appreciating what you have done. But guys, from the 60s, imagine we are still struggling of not even having a school in our countryside regions. Hence, claiming that you have resources and everything. Yes, you have the resources, but willing without doing ends up doing nothing. We need to be active in our practices, doing things which are practical. We used to, I don't know why we always sound and behave superficial. And this is where we get destroying ourselves. We always sound superficial, as if there is somebody to please. This continent of ours, this country of ours, will not change. It will be maybe Rwanda, maybe Cameroon or Senegal. So for whoever serving it, we need to have the philosophy of trying to change it. If I am a president of 4 years, in a period of 4 years, please, it's better to see what to evaluate myself annually, biannually, and see what I have really contributed. Fellow Africans, the money is nothing. What we need to consider is the philosophy that says there is no success without a successor. You have had money, but you have destroyed maybe 4 generations of the people next to you. And finally, the money you have accumulated, you will not consume it. You will never feel at ease when your fellow Africans are dying of not having food, of poverty, of wars. I think what we need to set first is the mindset, and from the mindset, we shall grow up and make everything running. Otherwise, it's simply ruling around but pleasing the West. Because I don't see, actually, up to now, I don't see the role of African Union. Up to now, the conflicts which are being around African countries, I don't know which kind of conflict that have been solved by the African Union. So what is it there for? If it has failed to strengthen politically our unions, if the free trade African market has failed up to now, if wars, when the wars happened, the African Union does almost nothing. The only thing that I have seen they have really done is simply statements, communicate, talking just about that, but never doing something. I think some of the leaders think they will be killed because of maybe trying to not pleasing the colonial masters, but I think finally we will die. Better we die for the change or in the journey of changing our countries. Maybe one can die, but finally maybe the next generation will have been eliminated by what you have done. Academically, for me, I insist, we needed to please apply meta-knowledge, criticism. We don't need to simply use or fill the format that is there to never serve Africa. Why do we still learn or study things that never get practices or that can never contribute to the change of our continent?
Yeah.
And there we sit and then say we are scholars. Yes, a scholar, I think, is somebody who can actively, intellectually contribute for the betterment of even the village, from the village to the city to the country. But in the university, please, I was outside of the box of the panel because these issues were also not being friendly. But I would like that my fellow panelists, please help us somehow. Are really the knowledge that we acquired from academic areas, academic schools, serve in a fit way for the development of our countries, or just when somebody have published several journals in the known journals, of course, and the numbers simply can be awarded an academic document and be considered a professor, a doctor, But finally, I'm not trying to criticize that they don't have knowledge.
Yeah, you
but
should
finally,
think of concluding your response.
How our countries are exploiting the knowledges that you, the doctors, the PhD holders, the professors have researched. Our researchers are always in the university libraries. Why can we behave like that? I think if I cut it short, we need to also teach our leaders that they need to exploit our knowledges and put them into practices. We will see our economy, our everything running from our scholars, and of course everything will change gradually. The mindsets of African people will change, and finally the issues relating military the missions from abroad will end up changing, because today Modeste as a president, when I have called upon the international the UN missions, of course in the name of bringing peace, the citizens who are there, who are even illiterate, we never strike against that. They will just agree, and the UN missions will be there just simply cropping the money while we are dying of poverty. 1 year, 10 years, 20, 50, and that's how we keep poverty around us, like everlastingly.
Thank you so much, Modeste. I'm coming back to you. And it's true, it's rather good to stay in a society where, of course, there is more of action than words. And I recall we've had numerous editions like this where we reiterated the need for reform in the education system across Africa, which is in line with your last point, like you mentioned. Now, I recall one of the statements made by Kwame Nkrumah, Dr. FONGOD, that might not get the words correct, but it states, "Seek ye first economic independence or economic freedom, and every other thing shall be added unto thee." With these in mind, Dr. FONGOD, you're an economist. What economic benefits or drawbacks have been recorded in the host countries across Africa related to the presence of foreign military bases on the African soil?
It's the same thing that foreign aid has done to the continent. It's just the same. It's the same window. Right. And so this military basis comes, and then they provide some kind of foreign aid, especially around the areas where the military bases are present. You might have pipe-borne water, you might have some form of electricity, but those things are just, on temporary basis, and that is not any kind of a sustainable development that comes into the area. It's quite temporary, and so it basically continues on that trajectory where the African is being given bread, we are being given milk at the expense of us developing the capacities to feed ourselves, and that is what the Western world and the Eastern Bloc basically looks at Africa and desire for Africa to be. The notions that we can basically begin to pull ourselves by our own bootstraps, it's not something that the West really wants to see Africa achieve. But a time has to come when we fully take matters into our own hands and find ways in which we can begin to take care of us. And this has to be a certain level of economic freedom, which basically has to mean we must have absolute control over our mining sector, we must have absolute control over the agricultural sector, and then we should now be able to make sure that those who are in our universities, I'm talking about the people who are in schools, those who I think my co-panelist was making somewhat an interesting point, which is basically it lays with so much truth. That those who are in the academia, they should be able to contribute to the society. So this is what happens within the space of academia. There are people who basically goes into research, true, but the unfortunate thing is that when it comes to the kind of research that brings about sustainable economic growth, that would be research in the stem cells, research in science. Okay, for folks in biology, folks who are doing research in medicine, folks who are doing research in physics, the difficulty we have on the continent of Africa is that it is very difficult for you to be able to have any real research lab on the continent of Africa that can bring about something like AI, that can bring about something like blockchain technology. We do not just have those kind of schools, all right, with that kind of laboratory on the continent of Africa. So you have folks who are on the continent of Africa who all these studies is just basically theory. And so they have all of these studies that really doesn't really contribute to anything so far as the economic development of the people are concerned. And that is the problem where academia on the continent of Africa is really of absolutely no help. We have to find ways in which we begin to push young people to get into that part of education that is what I call push towards self-reliance education, where you teach young people to be able to develop a skill set that they can be able to use while waiting for something better, or while furthering their education. They're actually building, creating, contributing to the economy by the businesses they start as a result of what is it that they have studied. And most of this will comes in the area of technology, or comes, for example, even carpentry. Somebody just wants to become a mechanic, where they basically start something and then eventually build up from there. That will be something else that is good. Or someone starting up a business. I think that those are some of the things that we can be able to achieve so far as the continent is concerned. But the reality is this: military basis is not the way out. In many ways, the military bases will not really be able to help us achieve anything on an economic front. Rather, the military bases are always around or in countries that are rich in certain mineral resources, and they're there because obviously somebody has to pay. And I don't think that most Africans actually understand this, that when they bring these military bases, at some point, those African nations actually have to pay for what is it that they will consider to be security. And what that means is that there has to be certain kind of concessions in the mining sector in whatever minerals that these countries are interested in, even if the countries themselves are not the ones mining them, but they will absolutely have different companies coming from from their home countries to be able to participate in the mining sector. And that in itself is just nothing else but looting of the nation. So we have to be able to make sure that we take care of stuff by ourselves and find ways in which we can be able to bring sustainable economic growth, building small to medium-sized enterprises by us, bringing foreign direct investors into the continent that is not connected or leased or condition-based with any kind of foreign power that is being coerced by the military presence we have in our individual nations.
Indeed, Dr. FONGOD, back to you, Modest. You mentioned earlier on that the African Union so far has not been able to address some of the crises plaguing the African continent. Now, highlighting some of the shortcomings, we have seen the presence of the regional blocs across Africa, from SADC to the ESC to CEMAC to others across the African continent, even ECOWAS, trying as much as possible to get involved in trying to quell some of these tensions plaguing the African continent. Even IGAD has been, trying to cooperate at that level. With the deployment of those numerous regional bodies, forces or troops to respective African nations to help in quelling those tensions, how, from your own perspective, can some of these bodies, be it a continental body like the African Union or the regional body like the East African Community from which Rwanda happens to belong, how can they contribute? What alternative, what parameters could you solicit, could you bring to the table that could be used in addressing some of these tensions in a bid to reduce the presence of this foreign military, bases on the African continent?
There is nothing like I can advise anybody, because this requires somebody at the head or leading to have that philosophy, himself or herself. This is not something you can acquire from school or whatever. We simply pray the Almighty God or from the academia to have to recruit or even try to make sure we get some or real revolutionaries like Nkrumahs and others of their period, Simply that. Because what I have realized is that these leaders of ours, most of the time, they fear like nothing. Sometimes maybe they have self-censorship that maybe they will be killed because of have touched on the interests of somebody. That's what actually happened. There's nothing like, anyway, let me illustrate it with the example of the president of Rwanda. Many times he has been defended of doing something by the Western people, and finally he did it. Yesterday I was reading about what the former general of army of Rwanda, he was talking about what they have been passing through in the time of when he was still leading the Rwandan military forces, that one of the European general who was actually his friend put him beside and then secretly told him that the fact of Rwanda, when Rwanda was taking Rwandan refugees who were outside of Rwanda actually primarily they brought them back in their motherland. And the other general told him that Rwanda was to suffer. Nobody was actually to congratulate Rwanda of have repatriated his refugees who was abroad or outside of the country. Imagine, for them, they are happy when in a country there is issues. When the issues are burning in the country, it's where their intelligence operations happened. And when you see aids from international organizations, these aids, yes, they sometimes help us, but it's through those aids that they control us. Unfortunately, because we have destroyed our country, we can't chase them out. We're still under their rules around while they are getting information from our country. And from the informations they have from our country, they will of course set the second barriers so as we will never jump over. And that's how they keep us down. So I don't think, if I can come back to the issue that you are talking, the question, there is nothing like we can advise because they know it all. They know the multinationals or the international organizations are simply serving their interest. But the issue is, are we having revolutionaries over our countries, or simply we are having the Western puppets who are just there to serve their personal and their bosses' interest? That is the only issue. And for us, the citizens, when we are electing our leaders, by the definition, the real definition of a leader is somebody who is there ready to die for his sheep. Meanwhile, that means a leader is actually somebody who can, if even possible, die for his country, for his citizens. And that means it is somebody who is there who cannot first serve his personal interest rather than the country or the national interest. Now, if we try to evaluate the leaders we have, do they do or do they behave like we do? Always when we are electing, we elect somebody from just our zone, from our tribe. This is the issue that we first and foremost need to educate. And as I was talking about, when we have good families, we will end up having good citizens. And by having good citizens, that's how we will have good leaders, because there is we can't have a leader who is coming from a bad family. And when I talk about a bad family, I'm not talking about an academic background, no. I'm not talking about rich, being from fortune, no. But I'm talking about having a patriotism philosophy, a love of your country, being decent in the mind. When you see the virtue, I will appreciate when African Union will, or even the blocks we have, when we will start avoiding conflicts within ourselves, cheap conflicts, when we will start destroying the virtual borders that were set in Berlin when Africans were not there, when we will start destroying the virtual borders set when we were not even present it is then that I will say then Africa is trying to see the sun. It's then that I will say we are starting then to see something like change. Otherwise, now that we are under things that are not there for our interests, we don't need to expect anything called development or growth economically. And when we talk about military, for me, I can't go and I can't discuss even 10 minutes the issues of security peacekeepers. No, they are there just for the benefits of their countries. That is all, and that's finished. I don't need to comment about that. Simply what we need to do, how we can do to maybe uplift ourselves, is simply working on the education of our social classes, education of our young generations, educating them properly. If they have been even sent in Europe or Asia or America, let them come back with the knowledge, but with a sense of applying them in our countries. We need to develop our agricultural sector for, first and foremost, our mothers, our sisters, our friends to have food. 2, we need to develop our social cohesion. People to know that they need to peacefully live, cohabitate peacefully as friends, as Africans. That is the only thing that will keep these people away of us. Now, when we have our, like Modeste or somebody else who started in Europe or US, when he come back, he will start to pose like Americans. Yeah, it's fine. What I will appreciate is simply bringing American knowledge, but still or remaining African. And remaining African, what I mean is coming at your home, start changing from the grassroots or from the ground what is there. As a scholar, you have studied, you know everything that our mothers don't know. Our young friends who remains in Africa have not know that. So coming from everywhere, wherever in the corner of the world, please, let's come with the knowledge that has really inspired us and try to apply them at our homeland and then see if the changes will come. The challenge is that when we come, we don't have the philosophy or even the mind of helping our society to grow, but we simply want to be in good suits, and we are only targeting sitting in the office and try to apply the American style without contextualizing them. My fellow friends, my fellow African, what we can do to change everything that we are being imposed by the Western world is simply that we can change the education systems, the social cohesion, keep our culture, modernize them in a way that can simply and only help us develop, not just putting them there and try to implement things which are not implementable.
All right, thank you so much. Modeste NKURIKIYIMANA joined us all the way from Rwanda in his capacity as a senior journalist, a Great Lakes political analyst, and a Pan-African. Thank you so much. To culminate today's conversation with you, Dr. FONGOD, you listen to your co-panelists, and both of you have the same point of view. You guys reiterated, or you both reiterated, the need for Africa to stand up for itself. Africa can do better without the presence of foreign military bases. Now, with the current trends we're seeing across Africa, let me use an example. We saw in Burkina Faso, when Captain Ibrahim Traoré, now the transitional president of, or the interim president of the West African country, took over away from the security crisis that the country was facing, it has dropped significantly in recent times. We can relate with what's happening in the Sahel. Now, we've seen in Chad where the foreign military forces or troops in the country from France have actually handed over military bases back to the national army. Given this recent trends we're seeing across Africa, will Africa see a decrease in foreign military bases in the next decade? And what should be the way forward for Africa? An Africa that can be self-reliant, an Africa that can depend on itself for its own prosperity. in a bit to conclude today's conversation?
I think that when the African begin to love their own children more than they hate their enemies, then the issues of conflict and civil wars and terrorism on the continent of Africa will cease. We have to come into a place where we fully understand that there is a whole entire industry, it's called the military industrial complex, that is behind a lot of the issues we find happening around the world and especially on the continent of Africa. You see, there are people who make guns, there are people who manufacture tanks, there are people who make bullets, there are people who make RPGs, there are people who are very good in manufacturing AK-47s. The issue is most of these men in these industries that is publicly traded on stock exchanges around the world, most of these men needs to be able to keep the business booming. And how do you keep that business booming? You keep the business booming by making sure that there's war around the world. It's the same thing with hospitals. Or drug manufacturers, people who manufacture drugs. If you had a drug that could end cancer, if you had a drug that could end HIV, that was just going to stop it right on its tracks, nobody will be sick of cancer, nobody will absolutely die of HIV, of AIDS. Guess what happens? You will basically be destroying that particular industry in their minds, because they make money by keeping you alive, and then you depending on the drugs that they give you to keep you alive. So the wars and the problems we face on the African continent and around the world is because of the military industrial complex. We have to find a way in which we understand that fully on the African continent and know that you are my brother, you are my sister, that your living, your very existence is what is very important to the survival of the continent. That I need your skill sets, you need my skill sets, that together we can come and create this synergy and build a robust continent that will thrive on economic levels, that will thrive in the areas of peace, that will thrive in agriculture, that will thrive in mining, that will be a beacon of hope for the rest of the world. And I think that Africa is strategically placed in this particular time in history to be able to achieve all three coordinates. We can be able to achieve peace, we can be able to achieve exponential growth in the areas of technology, and we can also be able to achieve exponential growth in the areas of agriculture and mining. If that was going to be the case, I think that Africa will basically emerge to be as strong as it should be, and there will be no need for us talking about military bases, because what they are is of no help to the African.
Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your input in your capacity as a Pan-Africanist economist as well as a fintech expert. I'll say is on this note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point. Thank you immensely for your great and insightful participation in the course of today's edition of the program. Dear audience, we say thank you for your keen attention, thank you for listening, and to stay in company of our numerous transmissions.